Did they know about the EMP blast prior to the Trinity test? That's pretty much what's being asked there, and the answer is no. When we did the Trinity test, we were not aware that an atmospheric nuclear weapons blast would create an electromagnetic pulse. And it wasn't until we actually started doing some atmospheric testing, like what actually occurred at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, although we actually weren't monitoring the electrical grid of the Japanese at the time to be able to see that. It actually was much later when we realized that a nuclear detonation in the atmosphere could create an EMP. And what that is when the gamma rays that are coming out, you have this incredibly intense gamma ray field right there next to the blast. Those come out and they Compton scatter off of electrons in the atmosphere. What that means is basically a ricochet. That photon comes and it hits an electron and just smacks it off, and then the photon comes off at a different wavelength, and you've just created a high energy electron that's sailing off away from the blast. Now, what happens when I've created this high field, this high flux of electrons coming out from the blast, from this Compton scattering, is that if they're going perpendicular to the magnetic field, and those, depending on where the blast is, once they hit a magnetic field, they're going to be forced to turn. And when they turn, we know from Maxwell's equations that that creates electromagnetism. And it's those electrons that are turning around the magnetic field that creates the electromagnetic pulse. That's the electromagnetic energy that comes from an atmospheric blast. Now, the same thing can happen from space weather. If you have a solar flare that comes up, the electrons, they could do the same thing as they impact with the Earth. They'll curl around the magnetic field and they can create an EMP. That EMP will induce electrical currents through long transmission lines, and those can fry up electronics that are associated with it. Now, back in the 50s when this was discovered and most of the electronics were tubes, it wasn't that sensitive as modern electronics, which cannot really handle a large pulse of current going through that. And so a lot of the infrastructure now is made more resilient for that, so that if we had a coronal mass ejection or something like that, that we would not be crippled. And the same applies with an EMP. A lot of our infrastructure has been hardened for that. And thanks for the question. Have a good day. Bye.